in which our lovers begin to learn the consequences of their actions. Chapter 26. Zviazhsky was the marshal of nobility in his district. He was 5 years older than Levine and long married. His young sister-in-law, a girl Levine found very sympathetic, lived in his house, and Levine knew that Zviazhsky and his wife wished very much to marry this girl to him. He knew indubitably, as these things are always known to young men, so-called suitors, though he would never have dared say it to anyone, and he also knew that even though he wanted to get married, even though by all tokens this quite attractive girl would make a wonderful wife, he was as little capable of marrying her, even if he had not been in love with Kitty Sherbatsky, as of flying into the sky, and this knowledge poisoned for him the pleasure he hoped to have in visiting Zviazhsky. On receiving Zviazhsky's letter with an invitation for hunting, Levine had thought of that at once, but in spite of it, he had decided that Zviazhsky's designs on him were only his own absolutely unfounded surmise, and therefore he would go all the same. Besides, in the depths of his soul, he wanted to test himself, to measure himself against this girl again. Zviazhsky's domestic life was also pleasant in the highest degree, and Zviazhsky himself, the best type of Zemstvo activist that Levine had ever known, had always greatly interested him. Zviazhsky was one of those people, always astonishing to Levine, whose reasoning, very consistent though never independent, goes by itself, and whose life, extremely well-defined and firm in its orientation, goes by itself, quite independent of and almost contrary to their reasoning. Zviazhsky was an extremely liberal man. He despised the nobility and considered all noblemen secret adherents of serfdom, who did not express themselves only out of timorousness. He considered Russia a lost country, something like Turkey, and the government of Russia so bad that he never allowed himself any serious criticism of its actions, but at the same time he served the state and was an exemplary marshal of nobility. And when he traveled, he always wore a peaked cap with a red band and a cockade. He held that life was humanly possible only abroad, where he went to live at every opportunity, and along with that, in Russia, he conducted a very complex and improved form of farming, followed everything with extreme interest, and knew everything that was going on. He considered the Russian music as occupying a transitional step of development between ape and man, and yet at Zemstvo elections he was most willing to shake hands with musics and listen to their opinions. He believed in neither God nor devil, but was very concerned about questions of improving the life of the clergy and the shrinking number of parishes, taking particular trouble over keeping up the church in his village. In the woman question, he was on the side of the extreme advocates of complete freedom for women, and especially of their right to work, but he lived with his wife in such a way that everyone admired the harmony of their childless family life, and he arranged his wife's existence so that she did not and could not do anything but concern herself, together with her husband, with how better and more gaily to pass the time. If it had not been in Levine's nature to explain people to himself from the best side, Zviazhsky's character would have presented no difficulty or problem for him. He would have said fool or trash to himself, and everything would have been clear. But he could not say fool, because Zviazhsky was unquestionably not only a very intelligent, but a very educated man, and bore his education with extraordinary simplicity. There was no subject he did not know, but he showed his knowledge only when forced to. Still less could Levin say that he was trash, because Vyashki was unquestionably an honest, kind, intelligent man who cheerfully, energetically, ceaselessly did things highly appreciated by all around him, and most certainly never consciously did or could do anything bad. Levin tried but failed to understand, and always looked on him and on his life as a living riddle. He and Levin were friends, and therefore Levin allowed himself to probe Zvyashki, to try to get at the very foundations of his view of life. But it was always in vain. Each time Levin tried to penetrate further than the doors to the reception rooms of Zvyashki's mind, which were open to everyone, he noticed that Zvyashki became slightly embarrassed. His eyes showed a barely noticeable fear, as if he was afraid that Levin would understand him, and he gave a good-natured and cheerful rebuff. Now, after his disappointment with farming, Levin found it especially pleasant to visit Vyashki. Apart from the fact that the mere sight of these happy doves in their comfortable nest, so pleased with themselves and with everyone, had a cheering effect on him, he now wanted, since he felt so displeased with his own life, to get at the secret in Zvyashki, which gave him such clarity, certainty, and cheerfulness in life. Besides that, Levin knew that at Zvyashki's he would meet neighboring landowners, and he was now especially interested in talking, in listening to those very farmers' conversations about crops, hiring help, and the like, which he knew were normally regarded as something low, but were now the only thing he found important. This may not have been important under serfdom, or may not be important in England. In both cases the conditions themselves are defined, but with us now, when this has been overturned and is just beginning to settle, the question of how these conditions ought to be settled is the only important question in Russia, thought Levin. The hunting turned out worse than Levin had expected. The marsh had dried up, and there were no snipe. He walked all day and brought back only 3, but to make up for it he brought back, as always with hunting, an excellent appetite, excellent spirits, and that aroused state of mind which, with him, always accompanied strong physical movement. And while it would seem that he was not thinking of anything as he hunted, he again kept recalling the old man and his family, and it was as if this impression called not only for attention to itself, but for the resolution of something connected with it. That evening, over tea, in the company of 2 landowners who had come on some matter of custody, the interesting conversation that Levin had been hoping for sprang up. Levin was sitting beside the hostess at the tea-table, and had to carry on a conversation with her and the sister-in-law, who sat facing him. The hostess was a short, round-faced, fair-haired woman, all beaming with smiles and dimples. Levin tried, through her, to probe for the answer to that important riddle which her husband represented for him, but he did not have full freedom of thought, because he felt painfully awkward. He felt painfully awkward because the sister-in-law sat facing him in a special dress, put on for his sake, as it seemed to him, cut in a special trapezoidal shape on her white bosom. This rectangular neckline, despite the fact that her bosom was very white, or precisely because of it, deprived Levin of his freedom of thought. He fancied, probably mistakenly, that this neckline had been made on his account, and considered that he had no right to look at it, and tried not to look at it, but he felt that he was to blame for the neckline having been made at all. It seemed to Levin that he was deceiving someone, that he had to explain something, but that it was quite impossible to explain it, and therefore he blushed constantly, felt restless and awkward. His awkwardness also communicated itself to the pretty sister-in-law, but the hostess seemed not to notice it, and purposely tried to draw her into the conversation. "You say," the hostess continued the conversation they had begun, "that my husband cannot interest himself in things Russian. On the contrary, he may be cheerful abroad, but never so much as here. Here he feels in his element, There's so much to be done, and he has the gift of being interested in everything. Ah, you haven't been to our school. I've seen it. That little vine-covered house. Yes, it's Nastia's doing, she said, pointing to her sister. Do you teach in it yourself? Asked Levine, trying to look past the neckline, but feeling that wherever he looked in that direction he would see nothing else. Yes, I've taught and still do, but we have a wonderful young woman for a teacher, and we've introduced gymnastics. No, thank you. I won't have any more tea, said Levine, and feeling that he was being discourteous, but unable to continue the conversation any longer, he stood up, blushing. I hear a very interesting conversation, he added, and went to the other end of the table where the host sat with the two landowners. Zviashki was sitting sideways to the table, leaning his elbow on it and twirling a cup with one hand, while with the other he gathered his beard in his fist, put it to his nose as if sniffing it, and let it go again. His shining, dark eyes looked straight at the excited landowner with the gray mustache, and he was obviously finding what he said amusing. The landowner was complaining about the peasantry. It was clear to Levine that Zviashki had an answer to the landowner's complaints that would immediately destroy the whole meaning of what he said, but that, from his position, he was unable to give this answer, and therefore listened not without pleasure to the landowner's comic speech. The landowner with the gray mustache was obviously an inveterate adherent of serfdom, an old countryman and passionate farmer. Levine saw tokens of it in his clothes, the old-fashioned, shabby frock coat, to which the landowner was obviously unaccustomed, and in his intelligent, scowling eyes, his well-turned Russian speech, his peremptory tone, obviously acquired through long experience, and the resolute movements of his big, handsome, sunburnt hands, with a single old engagement ring on the ring finger. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.